I'm so excited. It's my privilege to welcome everybody here to iLearn November. This is our second webinar, super exciting. Our next one coming up will be Noah Glazer, and I think we have a number of others that might be in the queue. So please check out our website at immersivelrn.org and more coming up. But for today's webinar, it's my privilege to introduce two of our directors of the Immersive Learning Research Network. First, Dennis Beck. He's an associate professor of education technology at the University of Arkansas. And in his teaching, he enjoys teaching teachers and trainers how to use technology in their classrooms. Dennis's research focuses on and advocates for digital educational equity for vulnerable populations, with an emphasis on culturally and linguistically diverse students, special education students, and older adults. In this stream, he's completed a mapping of reviews of educational practices and strategies within immersive learning environments, and he's examined the use of immersive learning environments for providing life skills training for low-functioning adults on the autism spectrum. Dr. Beck has examined the use of immersive learning environments for providing life skills training for adults with autism. He has studied the impacts of immersive art curation environments on vulnerable populations. And he has also helped to lead the Immersive Learning Research Network as the director of the Knowledge Tree, an international collaboration of scholars and practitioners committed to learning more about how to use immersive technologies in education. And also with us today, we have Dr. Leonel Morgado, and it's my pleasure to introduce him as well. Leonel Morgado is an associate professor with Habilitation at Universidade Aberta, the Portuguese Open University, where he lectures on research methods and software development. He's also vice president of the Audit Board of the Portuguese Society of Videogame Sciences and a board member of the Immersive Learning Research Network as directors of scientific quality. Dr. Morgado's main research interest is the use and development of immersive environments as tools for learning in business, which he's pursued since the days of 2.5D programming environments. Remember those? Leonel got his habilitation degree in informatics and a PhD in applied informatics from the University of Trás-os-Montes e Alto Douro in Portugal, and his bachelor's of engineering and electrical engineering informatics branch from the University of Coimbra, also in Portugal. He's senior researcher at INESC TEC, a private nonprofit research association with public interest status dedicated to scientific research and technological development, tech transfer, advanced consulting and training, and pre-incubation of new technology-based companies. Leonel's been principal investigator in 9 research projects and participated in 22 more, authoring over 250 papers. Dr. Morgado's current index is 23, with a cited paper of over 200 citations. Leonel's also had a distinguished business career as business and technical manager of Supradies, a hardware import, distribution, and retail company, as a terminologist for the localization teams of Microsoft Office 97, and Oracle InterOffice, language quality specialist for IBM Lotus, coordinator of web development and software development teams for nationwide surgery waitlisting management between Portugal hospitals and a Portuguese government, Directorate General of Health, and manager of cooperative extension team of 120 people fighting the digital divide in rural villages in northeastern Portugal. Together as iLearn boards of directors of the Knowledge Tree and Scientific Quality, respectively, Dennis Beck and Leonel Morgado have led the way in planting the seed of an interdisciplinary immersive learning research and sharing, knowledge sharing corpus. Their work to provide scope, ontological and epistemological considerations, and a thoughtful, evidence-based meta-analysis has been instrumental in building iLearn as a true scientific community. I'm pleased to welcome Drs. Beck and Morgado for this iLearn webinar today. Gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen and we can get going. Can everybody see it? I'm assuming. Great. Great. like I said, welcome everybody. Myself and my distinguished colleague, Dr. Morgado. I know he doesn't go by doctor in Portugal, but I'm gonna default to that with my tendencies, Leonel. Just really, we're gonna focus on today is a hands-on discussion of how to classify and describe cases of immersive learning. It's something that we have together worked on since 2017, and just really look at what's going on at three distinct levels: the actions or uses, the practices, and the strategies. And we're going to use two tools to do that. We're going to look at what's called the immersion cube to classify our actions, and then what we call the immersive learning brain to identify occurrences of practices and strategies. And we're going to explore how this enables practitioners and researchers to identify opportunities to change their interventions and explore novel pathways. So let me go ahead and let's get to that. Just as a background, like I said earlier, Leonel and I've done a lot of research on immersion in the past, and we kept coming up against a wide array of definitions of both immersion and learning. Not surprising, both those are really broadly based concepts. Lots of people from a lot of different disciplines. But we began this project by asking ourselves if there was a common definition or parameters for both concepts. And as you can see here, what we found is that there is some literature on it. First, immersion, we found that Agrawal defined immersion as a phenomenon experienced when in a state of deep mental involvement, in which cognitive processes cause a shift in attentional states, such as one might demonstrate from awareness of the physical world. And then we asked ourselves, well, what are those things in immersion that you can kind of break down, and the parameters of immersion? Where does it emerge from? And we saw it's really comes from the subjective feeling of being surrounded, which we labeled as technical immersion, absorption in the narrative, which we simply use the word narrative for, and then absorption with agency or challenge, which we use the word agency for. And I'm going to continue on here. And then we looked at the word learning, right? With the learning being such a broadly based concept, we really didn't focus on a definition as much as how we could operationalize learning in a way that would be helpful for the categorization of immersive activities. And as we looked at the literature, three main categories of activities emerged: uses or actions, practices, and strategies. So we define an account of use or an account of action when the literature reported an actual learning activity rather than its pedagogical educational rationale, or when it reported an intent without specifying the means to achieve it. Okay? And then we defined an account of practice when the literature reported the actual rationale, the pedagogical rationale of a learning activity without connecting it to broader encompassing concerns, context, or theory. So in other words, it was something more than just what happened. And then finally, we defined an account, we defined an account of strategy as when the literature reported those broader encompassing concerns, context, or theories, which either informed the practice or emerged from it. So that's kind of a quick background on both immersion and on learning and how we operationalized it. So let's now look at the first tool, which we call the immersive learning brain. So in the process of mapping of surveys on the pedagogical actions or uses, the practices and strategies in immersive learning environments, we realized the need to visualize the relationships between the practices and strategies used in immersive learning environments. We didn't include the actions here because they don't really have anything in common with the practices and strategies, while the practices and strategies shared that pedagogical rationale, right? So we thought practitioners specifically would benefit from seeing how experts connected these various practices with more overarching strategies so that they could use them in their lesson planning. And we felt that researchers would benefit from a systematic approach to examining which practices and strategies needed more research. So we mapped practices to strategy using an iterator vetting system, basically based on the existence of a straightforward connection between them. and we generated a thematic network, which enabled us to identify clusters and their visualization as a spatial graph. Now, as we did this, I just want to be totally clear. Leonel and I were working together, analyzing our data, and the first graph came up. And I think it was me, Leonel, who said, "That looks like a brain." And of course, I went to Google and got a picture and overlaid the brain on it. And so I want to make sure that said completely coincidental that it looks like a brain. It was not an intended thing at all, but it makes for a nice use for the name of the tool. And so we kind of stuck with it. And as a result, the benefit of this tool then is it allows researchers or practitioners to analyze practices and strategies by how they're related to each other, and not just by browsing through a long alphabetic list of unrelated practices and strategies. So the results of the brain clusters that we did when we did the analysis of the practices and strategies were 6 clusters: engagement and scaffolding, real and virtual multimedia learning, active learning, collaboration, presence, and then what we call traditional practices. So now Leonel is actually going to step up and explain a little bit more here about how to use the brain to interpret and describe a specific case and to enrich or innovate a case. Leonel?
Okay, thank you, Dennis. So the idea, could I use the previous slide for a second first? Okay, so the idea here is that we can use these tools for 2 different things. One thing is to interpret or describe. So you probably face this dilemma, which is you're having different papers or reports evaluating the outcomes or the results of attempts to use immersive environments, and you can't really compare them because they don't have a nice definition of what's going on. And so one thing we think you can use this is to be able to represent accurately what you're doing in terms of your uses, practices, and strategies. And if you're doing something completely new, you have a better awareness of it. This is our first part of the description of a case. The second use we are going to show of these tools is that you can set off from that description to try to enrich it or innovate from it. So let's go to a sample case to make this more concrete. So in this case, we are in a mechanical maintenance training situation. We simplified it so it's more easy to grasp and relate. And so the trainer and the trainee are both in this situation. The trainer is going to, oh, there's a bug there. It's trainee studies procedure. Never mind, we'll correct that. So we would have to correct it in all slides now, but so the trainee studies, reads and studies the procedure, watches some videos, whatever, prepares. The trainer demonstrates what is intended. The trainee then tries to replicate that by executing the demonstration. And the trainer observes, sees how it's going. And then they both convene and debrief what went well, what went not so well, what could be changed. This is a very common technical training and debriefing scenario. Let's describe it as an immersive learning case using the immersive learning brain. Dennis, next slide.
Absolutely.
So the first step is starting by the cluster that seems more proximal. And so here, we both thought, well, it does seem like there is some active learning here, some active context, because you are, after all, demonstrating and then replicating that demonstration interactively. So what we can do is look at the practices and strategies in this cluster and go one by one and see which seem to be occurring. So the strategies are indicated by that S between parentheses. Any S indicates a strategy. Any P indicates a practice. So let's go on to just to give an example. Next slide. So if we go, we will see that several of these strategies don't seem to be present. So like narrative, there isn't really a storyline here. There are some aspects, but not really a storyline. So no narrative, that's the on the top left. If we just go down from the narrative, you'll see a practice which is enriching student storytelling and role play. There is no student storytelling here or student role play, at least in this description of the case. So no. And we could go on like this. And we identified these arrows. We are pointing to the strategies and practices we did find. So we found, going through the arrows, we found some active learning theories here involved, some authentic learning involved, some after-action review on the right arrow, because they do debrief after. There is some authentic practice and assessment. There are contextual theories involved, and there is exploration, experimentation of concepts and processes. Now, I'd like to be clear that the way we reach these conclusions is not just by these names, is by comparing, by following the actual definitions of this. So how could we be sure that there is exploration and experimentation of concepts and processes? By going to the tables that define this. So table 1 in our paper for the Immersive Learning Brain describes each practice. And we need to find among this list that practice.
I'm trying to, oh, there it is.
And there it is. You can highlight it. So it's defined like this. It's practices which involve exploring, experimenting, and interacting with the characters and features of the immersive learning environment. That's definitely what's going there. You're interacting with those features. So it's about that exploration and experimentation of concepts and processes. So the same could be said of the strategies if we go check another strategy. So let's see, we have like their authentic learning, for instance, or after-action review. On after-action review on the right is a strategy, as the S denotes. So we go to our paper, table 2, and it's an assessment strategy, which is called after-action review. And you can see the definition there. After-action review, it's an evaluation and assessment strategy representing the pragmatic pattern of after-action review, the process of reviewing practices applied to complete tasks to reflect, learn, and enhance these practices. So that's why we think it's there. So this is a very solid, in terms of that it's grounded in literature reviews and thematic analysis, very solid way to decide stuff. Of course, the way to attribute it does depend on whether it's one person, multiple persons, or even a consensus approach, but you can definitely use this to describe your case in terms of stuff that is being used in other cases in the literature, because for each of these practices and strategies, there is a database telling which papers they were found in, and it's publicly available. We can then provide a link. We did not have the link here on the slides, but we can update the slides and include the link to the public database.
Leonel, can I interrupt for a moment, please?
Sure.
So one of the things that makes this a valuable tool for, you might say, why do I need to describe my own case, is as a researcher, as you're writing something up, there's not a lot of research that makes a clear connection between practices and strategies in immersive learning environments. There's a lot of research that talks about outcomes, but very little that talks about the practices and strategies involved in immersive learning. So that's just one potential usage there.
Thank you for that. That's helpful. Sometimes we forget the obvious stuff, like when we are enthralled in this discussion and presentation. That helps.
That's right. So
next slide, please. So after doing this for one cluster, you already have the description, so a more formalized description of your case. It says, in this case, these strategies are present, these practices are present. And now you could stop here So if you are doing, you must decide what is the point, what is the purpose of your effort. If you just want to get some rough idea and say, I think going into this active learning, active context cluster is enough for me, you could stop here.
That's right.
Or you could say, I think there are a couple of other clusters, so we could do another one. So let's try the next one. And here, actually, we could spend some time with the audience trying to discuss and suggest via chat, for instance, what are the strategies and practices that you find in this case. So we do believe you have access to that.
Yeah.
So
You should have access to the chat. So just go ahead and put in the chat now some ideas under presence. Okay, Nathalie suggested presence. Good. Embodied interactions is another one. And Mikhail, there's links at the end of the presentation that have links to all the papers. And so you'll be able to access those then. Oh, thanks, Leonel.
Yes, exactly. So
interactive visualization. Good, Fernando. Good.
So you got presence. Of course, this now we could go and check the definition. So we have 4 proposals already. So I think we could go to the definitions. Let's see if they are there. So let's check, for instance, presence. So that Nathalie proposed. Let's go to the definition. Presence, if you check, is a strategy. So let's go to the table on strategies. And let's find presence. So presence here, it's a strategy that guided instructional decision-making in practice by leveraging the technological affordance of being present in a technology-based environment. So we do agree. We are leveraging that. Embodied interactions are almost like immediate. Let's go to the interactive visualization. Let's see first if it's a practice or a strategy on the cluster.
Strategy.
Yeah, but so that people can follow. So let's go to the cluster visualization.
Oh, sorry.
And so Fernando said interactive visualization. As you can see, it has an S, so it means it's the strategy. So it's on the same table. And let's find interactive visualization.
And I apologize if I miss it and here the first time through. There it is.
Those strategies with a pragmatic pattern that guided instructional decision-making in practice towards the goal of leveraging the immersive context for visualization of learning content, including embodied vision haptic interaction. So definitely it's there. Then Nathalie also said social emotional learning. We can go back and check that it's a strategy, it's a theory, but you can find that on the diagram because it has an S saying a strategy. And so social emotional learning, it's related to social and emotional learning theory through the application of similar principles. And then you have to go and check what is social and emotional learning theory. Here, I would hazard that we don't have, if you go back to the case description, Dennis, on the slides, on this plain description, we don't have enough information that presents any social or emotional aspects. It seems very, actually very distant. The only social stuff would be the debrief, perhaps at the end between the trainer and the trainee, but we are not really leveraging other aspects. So again, it does depend on the specific details. So we could consider it there if we had more details. I wouldn't, with just in this sort of limited situation, I wouldn't go there. And so this is the process, and I think you did very well. So let's go to the next slide.
All right.
And so here is something we baked in the oven earlier, as you used to say on the cook shows. So here we found these strategies on that. So with interactive visualization, presence, one you did not mention, which is debatable, access and feasible situations. it depends. It depends on whether the actual content is about an invisible situation or not. For instance, now we can just discuss it from the slide, because the word invisible is quite clear. So, for instance, if the content was like training a procedure that can only be done on a live engine, on a live generator, or if trying to let the student use the generator would be very costly. So if there are circumstances that make this unfeasible in the real world, that would be the strategy there. Again, just like social emotional learning, it depends on more stuff. So just with that plain description down there, which says procedure, we could not go for access and feasible situations. And we could not go for social emotional learning. But with more details, those could be possible. The process is this. Again, the whole point of having these clusters is that you do not need to go through all the clusters. If you are a researcher, probably you will. If you're a researcher, probably you want to check every single cluster. If you are a practitioner or professional, you probably just say, I'll just look at one or two that matter the most to me. And that's enough to be aware of what's going on here and how to find similar practices. So let's move on. So the other clusters, we won't go through them all because we would completely wreck the time.
Entire webinar time, yeah.
Yeah, but just so you get an idea, so it's the engagement and scaffolding. It's about engagement theories, automated feedback and tutoring, coaching. There's all sorts of, it's one that has a particular kind of strategy. You can see there denoted as S_MF, if you could point, Dennis. All those strategies that have an MF, that MF denotes that that strategy is a model or framework. So if you go to the table in our paper on strategies, there is a section on the strategies which is called models and frameworks. These are basically fleshed out proposals by several researchers on how to organize your educational practice in these environments. So seeing any of these, you can go back to the slides, seeing any of these models or frameworks there means you really should check out the papers on them, see what are the actual proposals. So you can just go skim the other clusters and move on to the cube.
See, like for this one, coaching, demonstration, or observing instruction was a practice fit. We didn't complete it for the entire cluster, but that was just an example.
Yeah, but I think for
another cluster,
we can just mention the clusters here, and you can check out the slides, and you can move on, possibly for the benefit of time of this session, to go to the next step. So by doing this, you'll get a result. Let's go to the end result. And so we'll go through all these clusters, and the end result is that you'll have a list of all the strategies that apply to your case, and all the practices that apply to your case. This in itself allows you to compare cases, because you can say, I measured with a class, with a group of trainees or students, I measured outcomes. I wonder how this maps or matches the outcomes in other cases. So rather than just look at it in plain view of a description, of a plain text description, you can actually check if different cases that you are comparing outcomes used similar strategies and practices or not. So it's much more comparable way to try to discuss impacts and outcomes and hazards, barriers to adoption, and the resource use of the immersive environment. So this is the description approach.
So up until this point, what we've done is talk about how do we describe a current case. Now we're going to do, with the immersive learning brain, talk about, just on this slide very quickly, how would we enrich or innovate using the immersive learning brain? And I just noticed our title cut off the brain there. Go ahead, Leonel.
Well, yes, but the point is, you have now the option, since you became aware of where your case is amidst the literature. So you now have several options. You can just say, okay, oh, my case is smack amidst the active learning, active context. What else do I have there? What is the low-hanging fruit? So let's go back quickly to the green cluster diagram.
This one?
No, the active context. So before that one. So we could say, well, we are so much connected here. So what else is there that is low-hanging fruit, that there are practices and strategies with a theoretical affinity? So we'll say, oh, let's see, we have meaningful transfer there. I wonder if we could incorporate in our approach and case meaningful transfer, some more explicit connections between what the trainee was studying in other fields and what's happening here.
Or you could say something, could we involve some role play into this, a practice of role play, where there's a more of a narrative aspect of it involved.
And if you check authentic practice and assessment on the bottom on the right, you'll see there are affinity connections with stuff like assessment from analytics. So you could say, I might do that. Instead of just debriefing afterwards, I could try and get some analytical collection, like a checklist on what is being done correctly and incorrectly. And I could incorporate that quite easily. So this is low-hanging fruit, enriching by considering proximal, theoretical affine practices and strategies. And Matthew made a great question. Is the assumption the more the better? No. The assumption is that exactly that if you as a practitioner or researcher have to consider the entire range of possibilities, you might be overwhelmed. So let's go back to the brain, Dennis.
Which slide, do you know?
The slide with the full brain.
Gotcha.
So
this one? Nope. Sorry.
So this brain is a diagram of every single practice and strategy that we found on the literature. And if we go through the tables, it's an immense amount of them. So as a practitioner or researcher, you have quite a quandary here, which is, how do I even begin to consider what to do? People can easily get overwhelmed. So our proposal here is that you have here a guide of theoretical affinity. So you can just consider, let's go back to a cluster. You could say, this is what then is referred to as low-hanging fruit. In supporting your reflection, you could just consider, what inspires me here? What else would I want to include? Or you could say, what is extraneous? What stuff from other clusters am I using that I probably didn't think it over very well? So the point is that you focus your reflection on a smaller subset of what's available. This is low-hanging fruit.
Another point is that lists of practices and strategies related to pedagogy are plentifully available in alphabetic format, but actually that can actually be very overwhelming to someone looking through a list of alphabetically ordered list of strategies and practices. But if you're looking through using this tool, we've already done a lot of the hard work for you, in that these affinities between practices and strategies are already mapped out. And you could then use that to kind of narrow down the practice or the strategy, or maybe the combination of practices and strategies that you want to use.
Exactly. And so now this is low-hanging fruit. So just enriching, trying to choose, change, include, stuff like that. You can also use this to innovate. And let's go back to the brain. So if we now know where we are, if we know that we are focused on this case, the green cluster of active context, and on that I don't know what to call it. It's almost yellow cluster of presence. You could think entirely the opposite way, which is what is far away from myself? Instead of just looking at where our case is already very, very involved, you could say, let's go to something completely different and see if I get inspired to innovate. So let's see, it's green and yellow are on the top. Let's go to the blue first, exactly, the blue. What else could we find here? So it's saying, look, there are some models and frameworks, like the ARCS framework, the conceptual framework for therapeutic training. There is the framework, which is the 5E instructional model. I wonder if these frameworks could inspire me or could be useful. What else is there? Let's see. We have a strategy there on the bottom, which is multimedia learning theory. Oh, well, it's not exactly what I'm considering, but I wonder if that could inspire us to consider what to include or not to include, how to combine this. So here is stuff that's not directly connected to your case, but if you wanted to find something off the chart, something that you are not expecting or considering, it might inspire you for that novelty. So again, this is about empowering researchers and practitioners. It's about making you realize that this is not just a long list of practices. So now we have two questions here on the chat, I believe. Yeah, on the chat. And nothing. Okay. So let's see. Mario is asking, is the relation between practices and strategies always there? This is a relation by theoretical affinity. So we assembled three researchers, and we voted on whether there was, yes or no, a straightforward theoretical affinity connection between a practice and the strategy. We are currently designing a survey to approach a long list, as wide as possible number of researchers and practitioners on this same criterion, theoretical affinity. We could draw, and we would be happy if more people do it. People could do this kind of connections with different criteria. So you could use as a criteria whether or not people use this together on the literature. You could use as a criteria your community of practice, actual priorities and values. So you can change these connections. And answering, I think, Mikhail Fominik, what is the value of the connections? So again, it's theoretical affinity, yes or no, but the strength is the number of connections among nodes. Let's move on now to the cube. So this is about practices and strategies and how to use them. And now, Dennis, do you want to start with the cube for the uses, the actions?
Sorry, I was muted. So in the process of completing our mapping of surveys on the pedagogical actions or uses, the practices and strategies in immersive learning environments, we realized the need to visualize the relationships between three aspects of immersion: narrative, system, or what we call technical, and then agency aspects of immersion. Now, Nilsson had already suggested using what they called the immersion cube. So we adapted it to our purposes. And just so you know, here, the x-axis was narrative, and the y-axis is system, and the z-axis is agency. So to give you a few examples here, the origin, or 000, this spot, like right over here. Can you all see, Leonel, can they see my cursor?
Yes, it's quite visible. Yes.
Great. It corresponds to an unmediated experience, or perhaps something that's relying on a very low fidelity system. It doesn't have narrative contents. It doesn't have obstacles posing a noteworthy challenge or agency, something akin to waiting for someone in an empty parking lot. Okay, there's not a lot going on there, right? So now let's look at 010. And that's why I have these numbers up here. 010. So I'm trying to remember. 010 is something that is a high system, right, Leonel? And low everything else.
0, 1, 0. So it's 0 system. You are still there on the 0.
No, actually, system is Y.
Okay.
So X is narrative, Y is system, Z is agency.
Let's follow your description.
Yeah. That's right. So anyways, that corner 0, 1, 0 represents a scenario that might be like that same person in the 0, 0, 0 origin waiting in an empty parking lot, but in high-end VR. It's possible that someone might experience some sort of preoccupation with the VR environment just due to sheer novelty, but generally speaking, there's not going to be a lot of absorption at all because there's no narrative and there's no agency. Continuing on, the points 0, 0, 1 and 1, 0, 0 both represent situations involving close to no technological immersion, but a high degree of narrative immersion. For example, like a great work of literary fiction, or agency-based immersion like a Sudoku puzzle or a game of football. Another example, fantasy role-playing games. I'm sure several of you out there have played Dungeons and Dragons before. That would be the experience corresponding to the coordinates 1, 0, 1. So the game does not involve necessarily a lot of use of technology, but players often experience a lot of narrative immersion and agency-based immersion in those environments. The points 0, 1, 1 and 1, 1, 0 are more like your traditional video games running on technologically immersive systems capable of delivering high fidelity tracking and sensor stimuli. So in this case of 0, 1, 1, the game would involve an ideal balance between intellectual or sensory motor agency and the player's capacity for action. In the case of 1, 1, 0, the game would present the player with an interactive narrative that strongly appeals to the player's curiosity about events, about characters, or about the virtual space itself. And then, of course, the 1, 1, 1 coordinates might correspond to a video game running on the immersive system, but also involving obstacles, posing suitable agency, as well as an interesting story. So moving on here. So the first step, if we're analyzing our original case here, what immersion aspects are present? So remember, it's the trainee, sorry about that error, the trainee studies the procedure, the trainer demonstrates, the trainee executes, the trainer observes, the trainer and trainee debrief after. Well, in this case, the case used a high-end virtual reality system to make you feel present there. Narrative, there was a context and purpose for the procedure. So there was a visual interpretation of what it entailed. And then agency, no, actually, the trainer, even though you might think immediately that, oh, there was a lot of agency, but the trainee didn't have any planning intervention and very little choice of what to do in terms of the primary activity. However, the trainee does get to interact and perform freely while being observed and can participate in the debrief. So moving on here to step 2, asking more of a quantitative question, how much does it rely on each? Like for system, in this case, system, it's extremely reliant. It counts on that ability to feel present in the technological environment. So you can see there, it's high system. And according to this. Narrative, it's a little bit reliant. The visuals let you know your locations and tasks. So there is a sequence to what's happening, but there's no character roles, there's no storyline or anything like that. So you're down here. And then agency, it's somewhat reliant. There's no planning or little choice in the main activity, but the user does interact with the content and participate in debrief. So then we move on to step 3. Where is it situated? And you can see here, it's actually situated right here, which is very near the use case from our paper, simulate the physical world. And it's also near to the interactive manipulation and exploration. So you're going to want to enrich, you consider the uses under those balls. So under like simulate the physical world, or the uses under interactive manipulation and exploration. Look at those list of uses from the Finding the Gaps paper and say, oh, well, we might consider using some of these in our current simulation already. But to innovate, you would more consider if it is what you want or imagine, perhaps that what would happen if you lowered the system or increased the system? What would happen if you increased or lowered narrative or agency?
So could I interject here, Dennis?
Of course, of course.
For instance, you can see that skill training, which is that red ball down there, does not rely a lot on system immersion. It does rely a lot on agency and a bit more on narrative. So you could consider, I do like, for my purposes, all this system immersion being here in this factory doing this manipulation. But I do wonder, what could I take from skill training if it's there? What could be more agency? Well, what could be more narrative? Well, perhaps instead of just saying, this is the procedure, perhaps that could be a purpose. Perhaps that could be a case study, a narrative saying, the situation where you may need to do this procedure is as follows. And so that would bring more narrative, if you wanted that. The Nephi asked how 6 clusters map to this. The clusters do not map to this cube. This is entirely separate. So can we go back to the slide of the uses, the second slide then is the uses, practices, and strategies.
Yes.
At the very beginning of the presentation.
Or the next one.
Oh, next one, yes. So when considering a pedagogical activity, and that would be our case, we look at uses as something that is actually being done. Uses are something that is being done very specific, very concrete, you clearly realize what are the activities and actions occurring. It's
but
not
there's no pedagogical rationale involved.
No pedagogic rationale. So the practices, the pedagogical practices, when you say, if I do this, I want to achieve this outcome. That's the reason I'm trying to do this practice. And strategies have a broad pedagogical rationale, but a broader impact, broader effect. So we cannot easily connect the dimensions of immersion to practices or strategies without clarifying specific actions. That's something that we can evaluate: system, narrative, and agency. There is open work here. There is open work because if we go to a practice, perhaps sometimes you could associate that practice on some dimension. That is open work to be done, that we do encourage this connection. So for the moment, we did not analyze strategies or practices in this cube just because they have many ways to be implemented. When you consider strategies such as after action review, you want to discuss and engage, and that you can imagine that, but that's it. That doesn't tell you where you are discussing and engaging or anything. It opens the field. So we do struggle to put it there. With uses, on the other hand, it was quite straightforward. So if you can go to the cube, on uses you have specific stuff, but we did discuss something I can add. Let's go to the cube. That's in slide on the cube. So if we consider to the final one, perhaps with less text. So if we consider, again, a strategy like after action review, we could imagine as a broad swath of this cube being used. So let's say after action review, you do need to review. So typically that includes a discussion. So it includes some level of agency, a significant level of agency. It will have the meaning in that you are discussing what just happened. So there is some narrative there. You are considering the events, the outcomes of the events. And so you could imagine quite a large gap here. And it could happen in as little system as a chat, as a text chat, or as much system as we are all getting together in the virtual world. So I could imagine it as a big pain from low to mid narrative, high agency, and the entire span of system. So we could try and do that. It's open work. It has not been done or validated, but it would be interesting. Right now, we are really just considering the uses, that is the specific, very concrete and clear actions here. Yes, we can replay the actions we are discussing. Again, that's why it's so broad. On the cube, it would map to entire areas. And this is the kind of open work that we really would like to do. But the point here is, if you want to innovate, you could look beyond your current location, which is there between simulated physical world and interactive manipulation and exploration. And you could instead consider, what different uses would I want to achieve, and how could that influence? Or you could even just imagine, what would be this with less system? What would be this with more agency, less agency, more narrative, less? You can just try this as a lever to try to inspire you to think in different approaches. So I think this is the power of these visualizations, of these instruments, is that they help you situate your current case and situation in terms of the uses, the practices, and the strategies, and relates, therefore, to other stuff that you can more easily empower you to change, and with awareness of what you're doing. And so now we're going to give you a challenge.
There's a couple things. That's, by the way, that's what I would call the so what. You know, there's a lot of people I've talked to about the immersive learning cube and the immersive learning brain, and they say, rightly so, they ask, well, Dennis, so what? Why is this important even? And it's really because of the preponderance and over-reliance on in the field of immersive learning on outcome-based research is what it comes down to. And as a result, there's not a lot out there on actual uses, practices, and strategies of what's going on. And so people are trying to compare outcomes, and of course that doesn't work, because you're not even thinking of how you got to that outcome. So a few practical things that we can do as a result of this webinar, and wrapping up here, is we have open call for cases for what's called the knowledge tree, which is an open conceptual framework on immersive learning. And the idea of a tree as our metaphor of having the roots, the soil, the trunk, the tree limbs, the leaves, and then kind of the birds among the leaves as kind of a more involved metaphor there. But each one of those, we encourage you to analyze your cases that you have immersive learning wise, both practitioners and researchers, and submit them to iLearn 2024. You can see here the call for papers in the link. This is also a link, and iLearn 2024 is both online, has an online only conference, as well as in person in Glasgow. And I think I'm pronouncing Glasgow correctly. So share this cases this way to the iLearn. When it's submitted to iLearn 2024, they're indexed and added to the iLearn knowledge tree database. But also, as the director for the knowledge tree, I would just encourage you to email me ideas, proposals for the knowledge tree, and based on your cases. And I'd be happy to interact with you on a one-to-one basis on these, and kind of help you, coach you along the way in the uses of the cube and the uses of the brain for your own research and your own practice. That's pretty much it. I'm going to end by adding this one other slide, and because there was some questions. Here are some of the papers that we've had. The ones we've mainly talked about here are these educational strategies, practices, and uses, and the IEEE TLT papers here, and the use, that was the practices and strategies, and the uses right here, the 2021 is the Universal Journal of Universal Computer Science paper, correct? Right, Leonel, did I get that right?
Correctly. That's it.
Yeah. And then again, email your ideas and proposals for the knowledge tree to Dennis at Immersive LRN. Other questions that you might have as we're wrapping up?
The deadline, it was announced on a rolling banner earlier. It has just been extended, John, to the 30th of November, right?
30th
Final.
of November.
Yes.
Well,
Thank
that's
you,
good. I didn't notice that. That I think you might be right. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know. Did you guys? We did touch. I know you did answer this, but just thought I'd circle back to Mario's question: the relationship between practices and strategies. Is it always the same weight, or does it depend on each case?
Go ahead, Lena.
No, can you rephrase, John? Because I was answering Natalie on chat. Sorry, I missed the question.
Yeah, no, it's totally okay. Mario asked if the relationship between practices and strategies is always the same weight, or does it depend for each case?
No. That's the same weight. So we used this criteria of theoretical affinity. So we asked three researchers on whether there would be a clear, straightforward connection between each practice and each strategy. And so if there is consensus that there was a theoretical affinity, that there was a straightforward connection, that gets a link. So it's about their concept in what they are their poor ideas. We are preparing an international survey, a very broad survey, to try to get a much larger number of researchers and practitioners to vote on these relationships, and that could potentially change that map. We do encourage people to do this kind of stuff because our data is there, our definitions are there. So anyone can simply say, I would like to go into this specific community and collect their values. How do they think these practices and strategies are related? Is it like the immersive learning brain map, or do we in this community stand for a different mapping? There could be other criteria. So there could be criteria for, let's say, how often are these used together? So currently, we think that the theoretical affinity criteria helps you select a piece, a subset of the literature and current examples that matter to you, so that you don't have to swallow the entire ocean or drink the entire ocean of alternatives. You have a way to map the current knowledge.
Right. That's great.
No, there's an important question.
I wanted to make a point here. In no way are we saying it's our way or the highway on this. This is just this is beginning level work. It's exploratory that we've done. Now, it was extremely detailed work that we've done, but it's beginning. And we just welcome the research community to jump in, to cite our work and to improve it, because that's what research is about, right?
Sure.
And we want to go ahead.
Well, that's I learned too. We're open science, open design. We believe that, like, by crowdsourcing good minds and working with these connected sets of expertise, we can really get our arms around the huge variety of immersive learning, practices and perspectives. You guys have done a great job of this meta-analysis, and I love the really getting in there and kind of describing immersive learning from these various really useful perspectives. Like, it's not just engagement, it's from which direction. Yeah, and I really like the idea of like labeling those connections between those nodes. That was one of the questions I had as well, was like, could you go in and just like write a simple label between those connections, the line that connects one node to another, and get inter-rater reliability of like, yep, the thing that relates this thing to that thing is what? I just think it'd be kind of fun.
Absolutely, we could do that. Right now, we really just asked for a yes or no. Do you believe it? So we that. but it could be done like that. There is another important question by Nathalie here, which some people often ask. Can you go back to the second slide about the immersion definition? So Nathalie was asking what is the where is the immersive cube coming from? So this is coming from a very, very significant review of the literature on immersion by Nielsen and some of his Danish colleagues back in 2016. So what they did was, this is a very, very massive work. They compared the actual definitions and what was entailed in them of lots of literature on immersion. And so you may be aware of other ways to address immersion, like social immersion, emotional immersion, and stuff like that. And what they did was demonstrate that they could include all those aspects by consolidating the literature under these three conceptual dimensions. So, for instance, if you go to narrative, there is a lot of work by a researcher called Ryan on narrative immersion. And one of the key components of narrative immersion is the emotional connection with the characters and the outcomes. And therefore, emotional immersion is there. It's in the narrative immersion as it is defined consensual with the literature. And similarly, the agency immersion includes the social interactions and aspects, which is why one of those uses, which is collaboration, is so high on agency. So we do encourage you to check up this paper there, for instance, where we connect to Nielsen, which did all this amazing work on the definitions, and we do connect to a smaller paper by Agarwal, which brought something obvious that it was missing on Nielsen, which is a statement, which is there, a statement with the definition, because it helps. People like plain statements. But so it's just important to realize that all this huge amount of work by other researchers, prior researchers, has been consolidated on the cube by Nielsen et al., and which is, I think, one of the major stepping stones, one of the giants upon which shoulders we base our work.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you guys for your massive contributions. Speaking of giants, holy cow, Dennis and Leonel have done such an amazing work here on planting this knowledge tree for the Immersive Learning Research Network and for the field in general. So thank you both so much for coming together today and presenting this work. We're very grateful.
Thanks for the opportunity to present it.
Absolutely.
I enjoyed this immensely.
Yes, it was great.